Hello and welcome to Getting Lost with me and my good friend.
Dan, who is completely lost about Lost.
Okay, so we're on to episode 6, House of the Rising Sun.
Yeah, and another good episode in the same sort of style, focusing this time on the two characters of Jin and Sun. Yeah, it was an interesting episode, I would say. It was an episode that was largely focused on the character side of things, and I'd say didn't do too much in terms of the mystery side of things, but did
Yeah,
introduce something, a new mystery, and also did a lot in terms of like the dynamics shifting a bit,
yes.
particularly with the ending of the episode where they end up splitting into two parties. So yeah, it was another it was interesting episode. Definitely kept the attention the whole way through. So
And I think it really does a lot. It's really interesting in terms of Sun and Jin and their dynamic. That shifts constantly throughout
yeah,
like this episode. Also, because as we start it, obviously we've got this dynamic established where Jin is very kind of domineering and dominant over Sun, and she's quite submissive to him. And then like the first flashback we see, it's like almost a complete role reversal straight away, where she's like, as far as we know, she's like a high society kind of lady, and he's a waiter.
yeah. No, the whole arc that you follow is just sort of really interesting because you've got the first flashback which you cut to where she's clearly the one effectively from wealth is kind of the person in charge in terms of that sort of bits and pieces. But you've also got this interesting thing that straight away you establish the idea of her being somewhat trapped because she's the one who's like, oh, we should elope, we should get away from my father,
Yeah,
this sort of bits and pieces. And the whole arc of that I thought was just really interesting because you had this, what we assume is a rich daughter of someone who's probably a bit nefarious. I'm not entirely, there's enough hints that it's sort of some.
yeah. As the flashbacks go on, like it becomes clearer that he's a
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, some kind of darker undertones with some kind of Korean mafia or something going on there.
Yeah, because so you see in the first or the second flashback where Jin's done a deal that he can marry Sun if he works for the father, and she's clearly like shocked and like alarmed that he's
Yeah,
going to go work for her dad. So you're
yeah,
like, oh, that's a bit odd. That's a bit strange. But and then yeah, as it goes on, it becomes clearer that her dad is clearly some kind of crime lord or
yeah.
something.
Clearly very wealthy, but clearly there's something going on there, and you sort of come away with it thinking, yeah, okay. And it's really interesting how they've got that relationship to begin with, and Sun kind of views that relationship as sort of her means a way of escape. That she's in a relationship with someone who's effectively a nobody, doesn't have a
Yeah,
connection to any of this world, and her plan is to elope to America, get herself out, and just have a nice, happy, loving
yes.
relationship.
And then
And
Jin gets kind of drawn into the
Jin gets drawn in, and then it becomes Jin isn't the one that's going to get her out of it. It's actually Jin is the one that's constraining her and keeping her in, and it gets towards the point where she's looking to escape from him, and she has that slightly weird conversation with the person who's supposed to be the decorator.
yeah. So she's talking to this person who comes in and it's like, oh, it must be the decorator. And then it's clearly somebody who's trying to help her, with this person she's been speaking to that she's going to disappear into Australia.
Because they make the mention and the sort of explanation as to how she's learned English and that she's been having
Yeah.
lessons and things specifically to do that sort of thing.
And I think, and then that kind of what then feeds the really interesting like shift back in the dynamic in that she can now communicate with everybody
Yeah,
else where he can't. Sets up the thing with Michael to kind of get the watch back and for Michael to kind of effectively pretend to get really angry at Jin and then
setting free. Yeah,
set him free. Yeah, so the dynamic shifts throughout the whole.
but I mean, there was bits and pieces that I just thought, that's a really interesting look at a sort of relationship because throughout it, I certainly felt that Jin clearly really continued to care about Sun the whole way through.
Yeah, and then I think in that final flashback where she decides that she can't. She decides not to run.
Yeah,
It's very much like she still cares for him. Like she doesn't want to leave
yeah,
him. And that's what keeps her.
yeah. And it's like he's basically doing all of these things, working for the father, whatever he's been up to, that results in him coming back all bloody. And because there's never a point where, there's the point where Sun hits him, but he never sort of hits her back or any of the other bits and pieces. And he's always trying to do the right thing in terms of he gets her the dog and the other bits and pieces. But at the same time, it's clear that there's now this sort of massive gulf between them, which seems to have been caused by the father's work type thing. Although the one thing that sort of stands out is the completely over the top reaction that he has attacking Michael.
Yes.
So, and that again, sort of, you've got that flashback where he's come back all bloody and so on, and you've got when he attacks Michael, he literally does it in a complete and utter rage fest. So there's clearly, beneath the surface or somewhere, there's a level of I'm quite prepared to do violence.
Kind of reaction to Michael because it's about the watch, and there's some connection between the watch and Sun's father. So again.
Yeah, and so that's sort of one of the questions is like, why is the watch so important type thing? Because realistically, even if it's like the most important watch to you in the world, if you're sat on a desert island and you see a person wearing the watch, probably your first reaction shouldn't be to go up and start beating the hell out of them. It might be like, oi, that's my watch. I mean, obviously you can't communicate that well, but you can be like,
Yeah, and it's not like, and we've seen him trying to communicate. Although they're kind of isolated from everybody else, like there have been like the few attempts where they kind of
deal with Sawyer,
like water for fish and stuff. An interesting bit of background information I picked up is apparently the two actors with the languages is really interesting. Apparently Daniel Day Kim has like Korean background, but at this point he couldn't speak
any Korean. Yeah, I'd read that. Yeah,
and young Jin Kim couldn't speak English.
Right.
When she's doing lines in English towards the end, she's doing that phonetically. Like, so I thought that's just like interesting little bit background tidbit. Like the two actors, like the one who speaks primarily in Korean can't speak Korean, and then the one who then is portrayed as knowing English doesn't actually know the English to start with. So I think it's a really kind of cool central flashback, like a plot, I guess, is those two. And then your secondary bit, as you kind of briefly touched on, is the Jack's trying to get people to move to the caves, and then connected to that, they find the bodies.
Yeah, so referred to as Adam and Eve, which is another sort of, it's like, oh, there's an even further mystery now because they've been dead for 40 or 50 years, I think they say, which means they can't be the people who are doing the transmission that they'd heard earlier. The other thing that happened there was the interesting little bit where Charlie sort of says, oh, are these the people who are here before us? And Locke's like, what?
Yeah.
Because I'd almost forgotten that Locke wasn't in on that particular secret, because like it's like most of the lead characters know about it, pretty much.
Yeah, it's almost one of those other things that at some point I might feel the need to do like another chart connected to the mystery chart. It's like, who actually knows what about what's going on?
But yeah, that was a sort of interesting sort of thing where they find them, and it's like they've been kind of buried, or not buried, but laid to rest there. I think that is the term they use. It's not like they've just died there. It's like they've been deliberately placed in that location. So now you've got the sort of thing that, oh, okay, well, there's at least those two, and presumably someone had to lay them there. So people were clearly on the island then, and then you've got this message that's been going on for 17 years or whatever. So there's clearly was people on the island then as well.
Yeah, and then you've also got, I think, adding into that, don't know if you spotted it, but you get the black and white, marble type stones that Jack pulls out of the pockets.
And that was one of the things that the whole black and white thing. You've got the stones that were with the corpses doing the black and white thing. And in my head, I was kind of wondering if, because when they split the camps to the two places, I was like, oh, is this setting it up that one's going to be the black bit and one's going to be the white bit? Thinking that, you've got a black, dark cave as one and a that whole split is sort of a really interesting one, and was again why I was like, oh, is this going to be what this black and white thing's all about? Because in essence, you've got the people in the cave who are effectively resigning themselves to their fate, that they're not going to get rescued. They just need to be practical and make the best of it, in terms of living here. While the group on the beach are the optimists that will get rescued. We've not decided to live on this island.
Yeah.
It was the thing that really made me think about that is actually like the end bit of music, like little montage that goes on there, because I can't remember who it's by, but it's like "Are you sure?" is the sort of repeated thing that goes on there. So it's like you've picked a group type thing, and it's like, "Are you sure that's your group?" Seemed to be the sort of underlying vibe that was going on there.
And again, it's one of those things that they use to get some quite nice character development stuff out of, because you have Kate who can't seemingly decide for a lot of the episode.
Yeah.
And she decides to stay on the beach, and then when she's asked why, it's this thing about I can't dig in, and it's like, what is it about Kate that means she doesn't feel like she can kind of settle anywhere? She feels like she has to be constantly able to move.
Then you've got the other bit that I thought was quite good was the whole bit with Locke and Charlie.
Yeah. Locke helps Charlie basically kick his.
Yeah, he basically takes the drugs off Charlie, and you got similar to what we talked about in the last episode. You've got this Locke being the person who is saying there's something special about the island. You've got to give something to the island, and the island will give you what you need, type thing. And then,
yeah, I think that's an interesting one as well, definitely, because I think it's definitely clear that Locke kind of does that pitch to Charlie because he's seen the guitar already, like he knows it's there. But it's the way that Locke then decides to put that across. He doesn't say, "Oh, look, there's your guitar."
Yeah.
And
it was also kind of nice that Locke knew who Charlie was, which I think was being the sort of almost in joke that's been going on, where Charlie's been like, "Oh yeah, you might recognise me because I'm this guy," and it was like, "No."
Everybody's like, "What?" Yeah. The bit with Charlie and the bees. People are like, "Just stand still," and it's like, it wouldn't be an irrational fear if I could just ignore them.
Yeah.
But for some reason, I always think that's like further into the show. I always think that's like way in, but like it's every time like I rewatch it, it comes up like quite early. I'm like, oh, it's this bit. Out of the episodes so far, I think that's the one episode that is really massively focused on its like central characters and having the flashbacks, like more than any other of the episodes.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That it felt like there was more prevalence given to what we'll call the A plot, the flashback plot, because you also had their importance in terms of what else was going on at the time, in terms of the mystery of like why else he beating up Michael and all the other bits and pieces. There were some like interesting like few little bits and pieces. So like you got Kate going on about Jack's tattoos. There was a little bit about
right, yeah. There's an infamous episode about Jack's tattoos, like way later.
Right. But yeah, and there was also like the second time for Jack to ask Kate what she did.
Yes.
And she says, "No, you had your chance. You're not going to find out now." So there's a few little bits and pieces around that I thought was quite interesting and nice to sort of get the progressed on it.
It's quite a weird dynamic, I think, between Jack and Kate, because you have them kind of basically flirting in this episode and I think the episode before, and Charlie like remarks on it, and Hurley remarks on it, but then they have these kind of, so they clearly are like flirting with each other, but then you have like these scenes where like one of them is still being like really defensive about something and like pushing the other one away a bit. It's quite an odd dynamic they have going at this point.
Yeah, because it's like it as you say, they're sort of, it feels like they're flirting between each other a lot, sort of at various stages. And you've got, I think Charlie makes a few little comments, like he's got the, "Oh, you've got an in-joke now" type thing.
Yeah.
And the bit where he returns her shirt and she's like sort of being sort of, "It was full of bees."
Yeah, and then you have the bit as well where Hurley and Jack, and Hurley's like, "So are you and Kate a thing?" And Jack kind of says something, and then Hurley's like, "That's not a denial."
But then they end up in two separate groups. You know, they have this sort of almost disagreement in terms of should they be in the cave, should they be on the beach, and that to some extent, there's a bit of me that thinks that's why she ended up on the beach, was to either didn't care or would probably have sided with the cave plan. but actually by going on the beach, it created that separation that they keep trying to do. So that was sort of an interesting bit in terms of why she ended up in that group versus the other ones. And just who was in the two different groups was kind of interesting as well.
So it's quite interesting with how he chooses, because he waits to see who goes where, and kind of he's playing the percentages almost. He's trying to see like which is the best one to be in.
And he sort of, it sort of suggested, well, he sort of suggests that he's waiting for Kate to make up her mind so that he can sort of go on there. But yeah, it's interesting because you've got him and Saeed are in that group, which are the two that have definitely not been getting on in various shapes or form. Yeah, they're sort of almost the two polar opposites type thing. And it's interesting they stayed in that same...
Locke on the other side, who's very much like, yay, island. He's very much like, yay, let's go live in the island.
Yeah. So it made sense for him to be there. Jin and Sun both ended up in the cave.
Yes, they go to the cave, yeah.
Charlie's in the cave. Hurley's in the cave. Can't remember if anyone else of note is in the cave. But
I think that's it. And I think Boone, useless Boone, stays on the beach, I think
he stays on the beach. Michael and Walt stay on the
beach, yeah.
But yeah, that's the sort of... It's an interesting one because clearly they still have to interact with each other a lot, because the cave people are going to have to deliver water to the beach people and vice versa type thing. But yeah, it just seems like they've set something up there where they've separated the group, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out sort of in the long run.
Nobody goes kind of like, we can live in the cave but still keep the fire going. Like nobody seems to really say that. And you would think of all people, perhaps like Saeed would have that reaction. He'd be like, oh yeah, that's a really good place for us to like shelter.
I think they hint that it's a reasonable distance away, because Hurley makes the comment that it's not a short
walk,
type thing. But yeah, I mean, my point was, well, surely you want both of these things, and you definitely can achieve both of these things by having this. Either it's live in the caves and have a sort of rota system where you have people on the beach looking after the signal fire. Do something. But they've effectively accomplished that just by having two separate groups.
Before this, like loads of people have been scared about going into the jungle because of the monster. But now nobody seems to be bothered. Like everybody's just like always running into the jungle.
Well, I think that in part that's because they've managed to rationalise it to some extent. Because
I think a lot of people kind of rationalise it as it was the polar bear.
It was the polar bear and the boars and things like that type thing. And they've been in and out of the woods. Well, once you've done it a few times, it's like, well...
And the polar bear does get I think it's this episode the polar bear gets a name check or something where Kate says something doesn't make sense, and then Jack points out that she shot a polar bear.
Yeah, there was definite mention of the polar bear. And it was interesting that it was Jack that sort of points that out, because like he's been the one who's been the sort of rational thought behind it, but he's actually the one. I can't quite remember what Kate was complaining about. Was it something to do with Adam and Eve or so on? But she was saying something didn't make any sense, and it's him who goes, yeah, well, you just shot a polar bear the other day. Nothing here makes sense. So
she's like, oh yeah.
The only other note I've got down, which was kind of just an interesting little point, is that it's not really that important for this episode, but it's more important for the previous episode, in that when Jack is asked, how did you find this place? He just answers luck.
Oh, yeah. So he's evasive.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you can either view it as evasive in that he doesn't want to, oh yeah, I followed my dead father in here type thing.
Yeah. Or he doesn't want to admit it to himself.
Yeah. Or it's him self-rationalizing it in that he was just hallucinating, he was just wandering around, and it was just pure luck that he found.
Yeah. And actually thinking about it as well, I think you have to assume that he's done something with the coffin, because whenever other people get to the caves, nobody's like reacting to there being a coffin like out just in the entrance.
He smashed it up at the end of the last episode, but yeah, there's no sort of, he certainly didn't, there should be bits of coffin sort of knocking around and people would be like, well, what's this?
Yeah. And nobody reacts to the creepy dolls, but maybe they haven't seen them yet. Thanks for joining us for the House of the Rising Sun. Join us next week on Getting Lost for Drugs, Moths, and Oasis tribute acts. Meanwhile, leave your thoughts and comments below.